everyone, I'm Zerah Sedai. I am the first reasoner of White Ajah from the Weasel community. So if you want to know what the Weasel community is, it's basically an online role-playing community for the Wheel of Time verse. So you have your own little character and it's like a video game, but social media video game. I love it. I've been part of the community for 4 years now. It's very relaxed, it's very close to my heart. I love it. 2-bits, like seriously, it's one of the things that's been keeping me going. So I definitely suggest you check them out and join them if you want. If you're just here for the read along, I will be reading Eye of the World chapter 12 for you guys. It is called Across the Taren. Now, Eye of the World is the first book in the series. However, there is a prequel called New Spring. I would suggest reading New Spring first, but if you want to read this first, whatever, do whatever like floats your boat. Read it, cool. Join me for this. It's the reason I'm doing it. Okay, so we're gonna start reading, and I really hope you enjoy it, and give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, all of those things. Chapter 12, Across the Taren. Lan came down the stairs, telling the company to dismount and lead their horses after him through the fog. Again they had to trust that the warder knew where he was going. The fog swirled around Rand's knees, hiding his feet, obscuring everything more than a yard away. The fog was not as heavy as it had been outside the town, but he could still barely make out his companions. Still no humans stirred in the night except for them. A few more windows than before showed a light, but the thick mist turned most of them to dim patches. And as often as not, that hazy glow, hanging in the grey, was all that was visible. Other houses, revealing a little more, seemed to float on a sea of cloud, or thrust abruptly out of the mist, while their neighbours remained hidden, so that they could have stood alone for miles around. Rand moved stiffly from the ache of the long ride, wondering if there was any way he could walk the rest of the way to Tar Valon. Not that walking was much better than riding at the moment, of course, but his feet were almost the only part of him that was not sore. At least he was used to walking. Only once did anyone speak loud enough for Rand to hear clearly. "You must handle it," Moraine said in answer to something unheard from Lan. "He will remember too much as it is, and nothing good no help will come for it, if I stand out in his thoughts." Rand grumpily shifted his now sodden cloak on his shoulders, keeping close with the others. Mat and Perrin grumbled to themselves, muttering under their breaths, with bitten-off exclamations whenever one of them stubbed a toe on something unseen. Tom Merrilin grumbled too, words like hot meal, fire, and mulled wine, reaching Rand, but neither the warder nor the Aes Sedai took notice. Egwene marched along without a word, her back straight and her head held high. It was a somewhat painfully hesitant march, to be sure, for she was unused to riding as the rest of them. She was getting her adventure, he thought glumly. As long as it lasted, he doubted if she would notice the little things, like the fog or damp or cold. There must be a difference in what you saw, it seemed to him, whether you wanted to go on an adventure or it was forced upon you. The stories could no doubt make galloping through a cold fog with a Drakkar and lights alone knew what else chasing you sound thrilling. Egwene might be feeling the thrill. He only felt damp and cold and glad to have village around him again, even if it was the Taren Ferry. Abruptly he walked into something large and warm in the murk. Land Stallion. The warder and Moraine had stopped, and the rest of the party did the same, patting their mounts as much to comfort themselves as the animals. The fog was a little thinner here, enough to see each other more clearly than they had before, but still not enough to make out much more. Their feet were still hidden by low billows like grey floodwater. The houses seemed to all have been swallowed. Cautiously Rand led Cloud forward a little way, and was surprised to hear his boots scrape on wooden planks. The ferry landing. He backed up carefully, making the grey back as well. He had heard what the Taren ferry was like, a bridge that led nowhere except for the ferry boat. And the Taren was supposed to be wide and deep, and its treacherous currents pulling under the strongest swimmer. With the fog added in. No, he was such relief when he reached the ground again. A fierce hiss from land, as sharp as the fog. The warder gestured to them as he dashed to Perrin's side and threw back the stocky youth's cloak, exposing the great axe. Obediently, if still not understanding, Rand tossed his own cloak over his shoulder and put his hand on his sword. Lan moved swiftly towards the horse. Bobbing lights appeared in the mist. Muffling footsteps approached. Tap, 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 tap. 6 solid-faced men in rough clothing followed Master Hightower. The torch that they carried burned over a patch of fog around them. When they stopped, all of the party from Emond's Field could be plainly seen. The lot of them surrounded by a grey wall that seemed thicker for the torchlight reflected from it. The ferryman examined them, his narrow head tilted, nose twitching, like a weasel sniffing the breeze for a trap. Lan leaned against the saddle with apparent casualness, but one hand rested ostentatiously on the long hilt of his sword. There was an air about him of a metal thing, compressed, waiting. Rand hurriedly copied the warder's pose, at least insofar as putting his hand on his sword. He did not think he could achieve that deadly gleaming slouch. They'd probably laugh at me if I tried. Perrin eased his axe in its leather loop and planted his feet deliberately. Mad put a hand to his quiver, though Rand was not sure what condition the bowstring was in after being out in all this damp. Tom Merrilin stepped forward grandly and held out his one empty hand, turning it slowly. Suddenly he gestured with a flourish, and a dagger twirled beneath his fingers. The hilt slapped into his palm, and abruptly nonchalant, he started trimming his fingers. A low, delighted laugh floated from Moraine. Egwene clapped as if watching a performance at the festival, then stopped and looked abashed, but her smile was still seen. A low, delighted laugh. Oh, I read that. Sorry. Hightower seemed far from amused. He stared at Tom and then cleared his throat loudly. There was mention made of more gold for the crossing? He looked around them again with a sullen, sly look. What you gave me before is in a safe place now here. None of where you can get it. The rest of the gold, Lan told him, goes into your hand when we on the other side, safely. The leather purse hanging at his waist clinked as he gave it a little shake. For a moment the ferryman's eyes darted, but then at last he nodded. Let's be about it then, he muttered, and stalked out into the landing, followed by his 6 helpers. The fog burned away around them as they moved. Great tendrils closed in behind, quickly filling where they had been. Rand hurried to keep up. The ferry itself was a large wooden barge with high sides, bordered by a ramp that could be raised to block off the end. Ropes as thick as a man's wrist rung along each side. Ropes had fastened to massive posts at the end of the landing and disappeared into the night over the river. The ferryman's helpers stuck their torches in iron brackets on the ferry sides and waited whilst everyone led their horses aboard, then pulled up the ramp. The deck creaked beneath the hooves and shuffling feet, and the ferry shifted with the weight. Hightower muttered half under his breath, growling for them to keep the horses still and in the centre, out of the hauler's way. He shouted at his helpers, chivying them as they readied the ferry to cross, but the men moved at the same reluctant speed, whatever he said, and he was half-hearted about it, often cutting off mid-shout to hold his torch high and to peer into the fog. Finally he stopped shouting altogether and went to the bow, where he stood staring into the mist that covered the river. He did not move until one of the haulers touched his shoulders. Then he jumped, glaring. What? Oh, you? Is it ready? About time. Well, man, what are you waiting for? He waved his arms, heedless of the torch, and cast away the horses wicked and tried to move back. Cast off, give way, move. The man slouched off to comply, as Hightower once more peered into the fog ahead, rubbing his free hand uneasily on the coat front. The ferry lurched in its moorings, and were loosened, and the strong current caught it, then lurched again as the guide ropes held it back. The haulers, 3 to a side, grabbed hold of the ropes at the front of the ferry, and laboriously began walking towards the back, muttering uneasily as they edged out of the grey-cloaked river. The landing disappeared as mist surrounded them, teeny streamers drifting across the ferry between the flickering torches. The barge rocked slowly in the currents. Nothing except the steady thrill of the haulers forward to take hold of the ropes and back down again pulling, giving hints of any other movement. No one spoke. The villagers kept close to the centre of the ferry as they could. They had heard that the Taren was far wider than the streams they were used to, and the fog made it infinitively vaster in their minds. After a time, Rand moved closer to Lan. Rivers and man could not wade or swim or even see across where the nervous making to someone who had never seen anything or broader than the waterwood pond. Would they really have tried to rob us? He asked quietly. He acted more as if he were afraid we would rob them. The warder eyed the ferryman and his helpers. None appeared to be listening, before answering just as softly, "With the fog to hide them." Well, when what they do is hidden, men sometimes deal with strangers in ways they wouldn't if they were eyes to see. The quickest to harm a stranger are the soonest to think the stranger will harm them. This fellow, I believe he might sell his mother to Trollocs for stew meat if the price was right. I'm a little surprised you asked. I heard the people from Emmonsfield speak of those of Taren Ferry. Yes, but, everyone says they, but I never thought they would actually. Rand decided he had better just stop thinking that he knew anyone or of what people were like beyond his village. He might be able to tell the fate we crossed the ferry, he said at last. Maybe he'll bring the Trollocs after us. Lan chuckled dryly. Robbing a stranger is one thing. Dealing with a halfman is something else again. Can you really see him ferrying over a Trolloc, especially in this fog, no matter how much gold was offered? Or even talking to him at drill, if he had any choice? Just the thought of it would keep him running for a month. I don't think we've got much to worry about dark friends in the Taren Ferry. Not here. We're safe. For a time, at least. From this lot. Anyway. Watch yourself. Hightower turned from peering into the fog ahead, pointed face pushed towards the torch and the torch held high. He stared at Lan and Rand as if seeing them clearly for the first time. Deck planks creaked under the hauler's feet, and the occasional stamp of a hoof. Abruptly the ferryman twitched as he realized they were watching him, watching them. With a leap he spun back, looking towards the far bank, or whatever he sought in the fog. Say no more, Lan said, so softly Rand could almost not understand. These are bad days to speak of Trollocs, or dark friends, or the father of lies, with strange ears to ear. Such talk can bring worse things than the dragon's fang scratched upon your door. Rand felt no desire to go on with his questions. Gloom settled on him even more than it had before. Dark friends! As if Fades and Trollocs and Jokia were not enough to worry about. At least you could tell a Trolloc a sight. Abruptly pilings loomed in the shadowy mist before them. The ferry thudded against the far bank, and the haulers were trying to lash the craft fast and let down the ramp at the end with a thump, while Matt and Perry loudly announced that the Taren was not half as wide as they had heard. Lan led the stallion down the ramp, followed by Moraine and the others. As Rand, the last, took Cloud down behind Bella, Master Hightower called out angrily, "Hey, here! Now, where's my gold?" "It shall be paid," Moraine's voice came from somewhere in the mist. Rand's boots clumped down the ramp to the wooden landing. "And a silver mark for each of your men," the Aes Sedai said, "for the quick crossing." The ferryman hesitated, face put forward as if he smelt danger, but at the mention of silver, the haulers roused themselves. Some pushed to seize the torch. They all thumped down the ramp before Hightower could even open his mouth. With a sullen grimace, the ferryman followed his crew. Cloud's hooves clumped the hollow fog as Rand made his way carefully along the landing. The grey mist was as thick as here as over the river. At the foot of the landing, the warder was handing out coins, surrounded by the torches of Hightower and his fellows. Everyone except Moraine waited just beyond in an anxious cluster. The Aes Sedai stood looking at the river, though what you could see was beyond Rand. With a shiver he hitched up his cloak, sodden as it was. He was rather out of the two rivers now, it seemed, much further away than the width of the river. "There," Lan said, handing the last coin to Hightower. As agreed. He did not put up his purse, and the ferrety-faced man eyed it greedily. With a loud creak the landing shivered. Hightower jerked upright, head swiveling back towards the mist-cloaked ferry. The torches remained on board, and were a pair of dim, fuzzy cracks snapping the wood. The twin glows lurched, and then began to revolve. Egwene cried out wordlessly, and Tom cursed. It's loose, Hightower screamed, grabbing his haulers. He pushed them towards the end of the landing. "The ferry's loose, you fools! Get it! The haulers stumbled a few steps under Hightower's shelves, then stopped. The faint lights on the ferry spun faster, and faster still. The fog above them swelled and sucked it into a spiral. The landing trembled. The cracking and splintering of wood filled the air as the ferry began breaking apart. "Whirlpool," one of the haulers said, his voice filled with awe. "No whirlpools on the Taren," Hightower sounded empty. "Never been a whirlpool." "An unfortunate occurrence." Moraine's voice was hollow in the fog, and made her shadow as she turned from the river. "Unfortunate," Land agreed in a flat tone. "It seems you'll be carrying no one else across the river for a time." an ill thing you lost your craft in our service. He delved again into his purse, ready in his hand. This should repay you. For a moment Hightower stared at the gold, glinting in Lan's hand in the torchlight. Then shoulders hunched and eyes darted to the others that he had carried across. Made indistinct by the fog, the Emond's fielders stood silently. With a frightened, inarticulate cry, the ferryman snatched the coins from Land, whirled around and turned and ran into the mist. His haulers were only half a step behind him, their torches quickly swallowed as they vanished upriver. There's nothing further to hold us here, the Aes Sedai said, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Leading her white mare, she started up the landing, away from the bank. Rand stood staring at the hidden river. It could have been a happenstance. No whirlpool, he said, but... Abruptly, he realized everyone else had gone. Hurriedly, he scrambled up the sloping bank. In the space of 3 paces, the heavy mist faded away to nothing. He stopped dead and stared back. Along a line running down the shore, thick grey hung on one side, and on the other a clear night sky, still dark, though the sharpness of the moon hinted at a dawn not far off. The warder and the Aes Sedai stood conferring beside their horses a short distance beyond the fog. The others huddled a little apart. Even in the moonlit darkness, their nervousness was palpable. All eyes were on Land and Moraine. All but Egwene was leaning back, as if torn between losing the pair and getting too close. Rand trotted the last few spans to Egwene's side, leading Cloud as she grinned at him. He did not think the shine in her eyes was all from the moonlight. It follows the river as if drawn to a pen, Moraine was saying in a satisfied tone. There's not 10 women in Tar Valon who could do that unaided, not to mention on the back of a galloping horse. I don't mean to complain, Moraine Sedai, Tom said, sounding oddly different for him. But would it not have been better to cover us a little further, say to Barlon? What if the Jock here looks on this side of the river? We'll lose everything we have gained. Jockar are not very smart, Master Merlin, the Aes Sedai said dryly. Fearsome and deadly dangerous, but not intelligent. It will tell the Madrol that this side of the river is clear, but the river itself is cloaked in miles for both directions. The Madrol will know the extra effort it cost me. He will have to consider that we may be escaping downriver, and that will slow him. He will have to divide his efforts. The fog should hold long enough that he will never be sure that we did not travel at least part way by boat. I could have extended the fog a little way towards Barlon, but then the Jock here would search the river in a matter of hours, and the Madrol would know exactly where we were headed. Tom made a puffing sound and shook his head. I apologize, Aes Sedai. I hope I did not offend. Aes Sedai. Matt stopped, swallowing audibly. The Ferry, did you? I don't understand why. He trailed off weakly. There was silence so deep, the loudest sound Rand heard was his own breathing. Finally, Moraine spoke. Her voice filled the empty silence with sharpness. You all want explanations, but if I explained my every action to you, I would have no time for anything else. In the moonlight, the Aes Sedai seemed taller, somehow almost looming over them. Know this. I intend to see you Know this. I intend to see you safely in Tar Valon. That's the one thing you need to know. If we keep standing here, Lan put in, the Jock will not need to search the river. If I remember correctly. He led his horse up upon the riverbank. As if the water's movement had loosened something in Rand's chest, he drew a deep breath. He heard the others doing the same, even Tom. Then he remembered an old saying, better to spit in a wolf's eye than to cross an Aes Sedai. Yet the tension had lessened. Moraine was not looming over anyone. She barely even reached his chest. I don't suppose you could rest a bit, Perrin said hopefully, ending with a yawn. Oof. Egwene slumped against Bella, sighed tiredly. It was the first sound to even approaching a complaint that Rand had heard for her. Maybe now she doesn't realize that this isn't a grand adventure after all. Then he guiltily remembered that unlike him, she had not slept the day away. We do need to rest, Moraine Sedai, he said. After all, we have ridden all night. Then I suggest we see what Land has for us, Moraine said. Come. She led them upon the bank, into the woods beyond the river. Bare branches thickened in the shadow. A good 100 spans from the Taren came a dark mound beside the clearing. Here long ago flood had undermined and toppled an entire stand of leather leaves, washing them together into a great thick tangle, an apparent solid mass of trunks and branches and roots. Moraine stopped, and suddenly a light appeared low to the ground, coming under the heap of trees. Thrusting the stub of a torch ahead of him, Lan crawled out from underneath the mound and straightened. "No unwelcome visitors," he told Moraine. "And the wood I left is still dry, so I started a fire. We will rest warm." "You expected us to stop here?" Egwene said in surprise. "It seemed a likely place," Lan replied. "I like to be prepared, just in case." Moraine took the torch from him. "Will you see to the horses? When you are done, I will do what I can about everyone's tiredness. Right now, I would like to talk to Egwene." "Egwene?" Rand watched the two women crouch down and disappear under the great pile of tree trunks. There was a low opening, barely big enough to crawl into. The light of the torch vanished. Lan had included feed bags and a small quantity of oats in their supplies. He stopped for the others from unsaddling their horses. Instead, he produced the hobbles that he had also packed. They would rest easier without the saddles, but if we must leave quickly, there would be no time to replace them. "They don't look like they need any rest," Perrin said, as he attempted to slip a feeding bag over his mount's muzzle. The horse tossed its head before allowing him to put the straps in place. Rand was also having difficulties with Cloud, too, taking 3 tries before he could get the canvas bag over the Cray's nose. "They do," Lan told them. He straightened from hobbling his stallion. "Oh, well, they can still run. They will run at their fastest if we let them. And they would run right until the second they dropped dead from exhaustion they never even felt. I would rather Moraine Sedai not have to do what she did, but it was necessary." He patted the stallion's neck, and the horse bobbed its head as if acknowledging the warder's touch. "We must go slowly for the next few days, until they recover. More slowly than I would like, but with luck it will be enough." "Is that—" Matt swallowed audibly. "Is that what she meant? About our tiredness?" Rand patted Cloud's neck and stared at nothing. Despite what she had done for Tam, he had no desire for the Aes Sedai to use the one power on him. Light, she as much as admitted to sinking that ferry. "Something like it," Lan chuckled wryly. "But you will not have to worry about running yourself to death. Not unless things get a lot worse than they are. Just think of it as an extra night's sleep." The shrill scream of the Drakkar suddenly echoed about the fog-covered river. Even the horses froze. Again it came, closer now, and again, piercing Rand's skull like needles. Then the cries were fading, until they had faded away entirely. "Luck," Lan breathed, "which searched the river for us." He gave a quick shrug and abruptly sounded matter of fact. "Let's get inside. I could do with some hot tea and something to fill my belly." Rand was the first to crawl on hands and knees through the opening of the tangle of trees and down a short tunnel. The opening of the tangle of trees was sorry. At the end of it, he stopped, still crouching. Ahead was an irregularly shaped space, a woody cave easily large enough to hold them all. The roof of the tree trunks and branches came too low to allow any but the woman to stand. Smoke from the small fire on a bit of river stones drifted up and through. The draught was enough to keep the space free of smoke, but the interweaving was too thick to let out an even glimmer of the flames. Moraine and Egwene, their cloaks thrown aside, sat cross-legged, facing one another, beside the fire. "The one power," Moraine was saying, "comes from the true source, the driving force of creation, the force the Creator made when to turn the wheel of time." She put her hands together in front of her, then pushed them against each other. "Saidin, the male half of the true source, and Sadar, the female half of the true source. Work against each other and at the same time together to provide the force. Saidin," she lifted up one hand and let it drop, "is fouled by the touch of the Dark One. Like water with a thin silk of rancid oil floating on top. The water is still pure, but you cannot touch it without touching the foulness. Only Sadar, which is still safe to be used." Egwene's back was to Rand. He could not see her face, but she was leaning forward eagerly. Matt poked Rand from behind and muttered something, and then he moved back to the tree coven. Moraine and Egwene ignored his entry. The other men crowded in behind them, tossing off damp clothes and settling around the fire, and holding hands out to the warmth. Lan, the last to enter, pulled the water bags and leather sacks from the nook of the wall, took out a kettle and began to prepare the tea. He paid no attention to what the woman was saying, but Rand's friends began to stop toasting their hands and stared openly. Even Tom pretended that all of his interest was engaged in loading his thickly carved pipe, but the way he leaned forward towards the women gave him away. Moraine and Egwene acted as if they were alone. No, Moraine said into question. You know what? Actually, I'm just going to have some water because my throat is very dry, and then I'll maybe hopefully read better. Okay. Okay, no, Moraine said in answer to a question Rand had missed. The true source cannot be used up, any more than a river can be used up by a water of mill. The source is the river, the Aes Sedai, the water mill. And you really think I can learn? Egwene asked. Her face shone with eagerness. Rand had never seen her look so beautiful, or so far away from him. Can I become an Aes Sedai? Rand jumped up, creaking his head against the low roof of the logs. Tom Merlin grabbed his arm, yanking him back down. Don't be a fool, the gleeman murmured. He eyed the woman, neither seemed to have noticed, and the look gave Rand was sympathetic. It's beyond you now, boy. Child, Moraine said gently. Only very few can learn to touch the true source and use the one power. Some of those can learn to a greater degree, some to a lesser. You're one of the bare handful for whom there is no need to learn. At least touching the source will come to you whether you want it or not. Without the teaching you can receive in Tar Balan, though, you'll never learn to channel it fully. And you may not survive. Men who have the ability to touch Sadin, born with them, die. Of course, if the Red Ajah does not find them and gentle them. Tom Merlin growled deep in his throat, and Rand shifted uncomfortably. Men like those of whom the Aes Sedai spoke were rare. He had only heard of 3 in his whole life, and thank the light never in 2 rivers. But the damage they did before the Aes Sedai found them was bad enough for the news to carry. The news of wars, of earthquakes that destroyed cities. He had never really understood what the Ages did. According to the stories, there were societies among the Aes Sedai that seemed to plot and squabble among themselves more than anything else. But the stories were clear on one point. Also, side note, Aes Sedai, we don't do that. But I mean, whatever. The Red Ajah held its prime duty to the prevention of another breaking of the world. They did it by hunting down every man who had ever dreamed of wielding the one power. Matt and Perrin looked as if they suddenly wished they were back home in their beds. But some women died too. It's hard to learn without a guide. The women we do not find, those who live, often become, well, in this part of the world, they might become wisdoms of their village. The Aes Sedai paused thoughtfully. The old blood is strong in Emonsfield, and the old blood sings. I knew you for what you were the moment I saw you. No Aes Sedai can stand in the presence of a woman who can channel or is close to her change and not feel it. She rummaged in the pouch at her belt and produced a small blue gem on a gold chain that she had earlier worn in her hair. You're very close to your change, your first touching. It will be better if I guide you through it. That way you will avoid the unpleasant effects that come to those who find it their own way. Egwene's eyes widened as she looked at the stone, and she wet her lips repeatedly. Does that have the power? Of course not, Moraine snapped. Things do not have the power, child. Even young girl is only a tool. This is just a pretty blue stone, but it can give off light. Here. Egwene's hands trembled as Moraine laid the stone on her fingertips. She started to pull it back, but the Aes Sedai held both hands over hers and gently touched the other to the side of Egwene's head. Look at the stone, the Aes Sedai said softly. It is better than fumbling alone. Clear your mind of everything but the stone. Clear your mind and let yourself drift. There's only the stone and emptiness. I will begin it. Drift, and let me guide you. No thoughts. Drift. Rand's fingers dug into his knees. His jaw clenched until they hurt. She has to fail. She has to. The light bloomed in the stone, just one flash of blue and then gone, no brighter than a firefly. But he flinched as if it had been blinding. Egwene and Moraine stared into the stone, faces empty. Another flash came, and another, until the azure light pulsed like a beating of a heart. It's the Aes Sedai, he thought desperately. Moraine's doing it, not Egwene. One last feeble flicker, and the stone was merely bulbable again. Rand held his breath. For a moment, Egwene continued to stare into the small stone, before she looked up at Moraine. I thought I felt something, but perhaps you're mistaken about me. I'm sorry I wasted your time. I have not wasted anything, child. A smile of satisfaction faltered across Moraine's lip. The last light was yours alone. It was? Egwene exclaimed, then slid immediately back into glumness. But it was barely there at all. Now you are behaving like a foolish village girl. Most who come to Tar Valon must study months before they can do what you just did. You may go far, perhaps even the ambulance seat one day, if you study and work hard. You mean? With a cry of delight, Egwene threw her arms around the Aes Sedai. Oh, thank you! Rand, did you hear? I'm going to be an Aes Sedai! That is the end of chapter 12. And then they have this little diagram drawing thing. So yeah. And then chapter 13, which I'm not going to read, but someone else might read it. So stay tuned for that. Thank you for joining me for this read along. I really hope you enjoyed it. I fumbled over a little bit of words, but I really enjoyed reading to you guys. So yeah, if you want to join our community, send a message. DM's always open. We have a Discord channel now too. I'm very active on Discord with users a lot less data than Instagram. So I love my Discord. But I'm also quite active on Instagram. I am super excited. We're going to see what this community has for you, and just thank you for being a part if you're a part, and if not, please join. We'd love to have you. Love from the White Ajah. I bubble you. Have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful day or night, wherever it is by you guys, and thank you for joining me for this.